Hey everyone, I am Doug Gordon, and I'm one of the co-hosts of The War on Cars. This is a preview of an exclusive episode just for Patreon subscribers. It's about the situation in Canada, where Ontario Premier Doug Ford is pushing legislation that would drastically impede the ability of cities to install bike lanes. To hear the whole thing, please sign up on Patreon. We are a homegrown, independent podcast and rely on listener support to keep the show going and growing. Every dollar we get goes back into producing episodes that we hope bring you the best news and information about the people, places, and ideas taking on car culture. So you can help us out by becoming a member of our awesome Patreon community. Go to thewaroncars.org, click Patreon, and sign up today. Starting at just $3 per month, you'll get access to exclusive bonus episodes like this one, ad-free versions of regular episodes, merch discounts, pre-sale access to live shows, and more. Plus, we will send you a handwritten thank you note as a token of our appreciation. Thanks so much for your support. Let's talk about Bill 212, which is also called the Reducing Gridlock, Saving You Time Act. It's described as a framework for bike lanes that require removal of a traffic lane. What's going on with this bill, Sabrina?
Yeah, so this is essentially like an omnibus package from our transportation minister, Prabmeet Sarkaria, and the Ford government. If the title of the bill didn't clue you in right away, the Ford government has been framing their anti-bike lane crusade as a way to reduce gridlock and ease traffic, which I think the facts behind that is maybe more debatable, but at least that's how they're framing it. So hence the name of this bill. It does a lot of things speeding up highway construction, but the part that we're interested in is the bike lane stuff. And essentially, it's going to make municipalities, which are essentially creatures of the provincial government, it's going to make them seek provincial approval to green light future bike lanes, and that's also, you got to kind of dig into the fine print there, because there will be no future bike lanes in situations where they rip up other lanes of traffic. And so I think a lot of cycling advocates are saying this is, of course, going to put a chill on bike lanes. They've already taken moves to actually rip up some existing bike lanes on some of the main arteries in Toronto, and there's been a lot of pushback. The Toronto mayor, Olivia Chow, has essentially come out swinging against the Ford government and said that they're meddling in municipal minutia. They should be focusing on things like healthcare and education. But as you guys sort of laid out at the outset, everything is political, and there's a lot of politics at play here.
It's my understanding that there are these bike lanes in Toronto, Bloor Street, Yonge Street, and University Avenue. Those are targeted by this. Could you talk about why those bike lanes are important? I seem to remember that these bike lanes have been the focus of a back and forth for many years now, including there have been surveys, I think, showing that the bike lanes have been good for business on those streets. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the role of those bike lanes is in Toronto and what the history is there.
Yeah, I think it depends on your vantage point. I mean, there's a lot of people who love the bike lanes and a lot of people who hate them. Those streets you mentioned, Yonge, University, and Bloor, those are all like major arteries in the city. And so the premier, Doug Ford, he says things like he's not, against bike lanes per se, but he's against having them on major arteries, and he wants to move them into the side streets. But infrastructure wise, that's going to also be a big feat to tackle, because some of those bike lanes are like curbed, like they've got concrete infrastructure there. It's not just painted lines. And now the province also says they're going to foot the bill for that, but we don't have much details on the costing. But on the other side of this, the Ford government, I think, is looking at their polling, because the premier's campaign manager, Corey Tenaik, and pollster Nick Kouvalis, they've been looking at polling, at what they've been hearing from communities, and they do see that a lot of people are ticked off about these bike lanes, and tend to equate them with traffic, which reports and facts suggest that's not necessarily the case. But you mentioned Bloor Street too, and I think Bloor Street is particularly contentious and caught in the crosshairs of all this, because that a lot of businesses and a lot of local residents in that area in Etobicoke have been railing against the Bloor Street bike lanes, and that's actually where Doug Ford represents. Like we refer to it jokingly as Ford Nation. The premier calls it the great state of Etobicoke, and so they have a lot of support there. And there's been a lot of backlash to the bike lanes in that area, and so I think the premier is also talking to his own base and offering up this piece of red meat and saying we're going to rip out these bike lanes. Studies be damned.
A little bit of bike lash in there too, which I feel like, he says he's not against bike lanes, just these particular ones on these streets where they're most necessary. Yeah. Bike lane fights have always been a microcosm of larger political fights and social problems in some ways. And it really does seem like you have this suburban urban divide that has infected all of our politics here in the United States, certainly up where you are. I know the polling is showing not a whole lot of support for these bike lanes, but does that change as you get further into the city and you actually talk to people who are using them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also been a lot of support for these bike lanes. I mean, we just had hundreds of pro cycling, protesters, if I can call them that, riding the bike lanes this weekend, like as a form of protest. And so I do think that this is going to be a battle, but it matters a lot in Toronto. And so it's interesting because these changes will apply province wide. And obviously in Toronto, in urban spaces where this is a more contentious issue, I do think that the premier is sort of focused on the 416 rather than the rest of the province too, because this is going to affect all cities and towns throughout Ontario. But I do think that's a good point. Like the more downtown you get, there's really no love lost with the premier. I mean, if you look politically, the Conservatives don't have a lot of seats in downtown Toronto. That tends to be more progressive voters like Liberals and New Democrats. But interestingly enough, the Liberal leader, like the opposition party leaders here, the Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie and the New Democrat leader Marit Stiles, they haven't really said so much about, against the bike lanes. They are saying that Doug Ford is using this as a red herring, as a distraction from things that really matter, like healthcare and education. But they haven't, explicitly come out against them or against these moves that the Ford government is making. And so, politically, they're trying to box their opponents into these corners because, especially for Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, this could hurt her not only in Toronto, but also in like the 905, like the suburbs outside of Toronto, Mississauga and Brampton. And those places, there's a lot of drivers, there's a lot of motorists, a lot of commuters, and a lot of them who vote. So we saw in the last election in 2022, the premier promised a highway that he promises that would help deal with traffic for those 905 commuters in particular. Even though there's not much detail behind it, but that helped win him a second majority mandate. So I do think like these motorist friendly policies are something clearly that the premier thinks is going to help him win an election. And we are talking about the possibility of an early election as soon as next spring here in Ontario.